In the quiet stillness of the northern fjords, where mountains rise like ancient gods and the water rests like a sheet of obsidian, there once lived seafarers who listened closely to the wind. For the Vikings, the sea was more than a route to distant lands. It was a sacred force, a living presence, a mystery that both tested and guided them. Before a single sail was raised or a keel kissed the tide, the journey began in silence. In the longhouses warmed by hearth and kin, stories were passed down, stories not only of conquest or trade, but of the sea itself, of how to read the swell of a wave, the pattern of clouds, the cry of a raven flying far from land. These were not legends. They were instructions wrapped in memory. The Vikings were not reckless wanderers. They were precise observers of nature, and their ability to navigate came not from maps or compasses, but from an ancient intimacy with the world around them. They watched the stars. As night fell across the fjords, the sky would fill with the bright spatter of constellations, and the North Star, called Leidarstjarna, the leading star, would shine steady above the horizon. From this fixed point in the heavens, Viking navigators could orient their paths across the open sea, even when the coastline disappeared behind them. It's easy to imagine a Viking sailor lying on his back on the deck of a longship, the creak of the mast above him, the cold wind brushing his cheek as he traced the constellations with a calloused finger. These stars, unchanged and eternal, were companions through darkness. But the Vikings did not rely on the stars alone. When clouds veiled the night, they listened to the sea itself, the way waves moved in long patterns across the surface, pulled by the wind and the breath of distant lands. They studied the behavior of seabirds, the direction of floating debris, and the subtle color of the water, which could hint at underwater sandbanks or nearby shores. And in the brightness of day, they turned to something rare and remarkable, the sunstone. Legends tell of a crystal, often believed to be Iceland spar or cordierite, that could locate the position of the sun, even through thick fog or heavy cloud. By holding it against the light and observing how it refracted, a skilled sailor could find the sun's hidden path. Whether myth or misunderstood science, the sunstone became a symbol of clarity in confusion, of guidance through grayness. Then there were the ravens. In the old sagas, it is said that before sailing into unknown waters, some captains brought caged ravens aboard. When far enough from land, they would release one. If the raven circled and returned, land was too far, but if it flew straight in one direction, they followed its path. These birds were not pets. They were fellow navigators, sacred to Odin, whose black-winged watchers guided the wise. Each voyage began with rituals. Before the longship left its mooring, a quiet offering might be made, a splash of mead into the sea, a whispered blessing to Njord, god of the ocean. Oars were touched, sails examined with care, not only for function, but for favor. A successful journey depended not only on preparation, but on harmony with the unseen forces of wind, wave, and will. Imagine now a longship at dawn, the village still sleeping behind it, the sea calm, the mist soft as breath. A crew stands silently, waiting. The helmsman, often the most experienced among them, squints into the horizon, not looking for land, but feeling the direction. Above them, the sail catches a whisper of wind. A raven lifts from the prow and disappears into the pale sky. No words are spoken, they push off. The longship glides forward, its oars dipping like clockwork into the dark water. The shore fades, the journey begins. But this is no simple voyage. This is communion with the stars, with the spirits of the sea, with all the tools and teachings handed down through time. To be a Viking sailor was to be a listener, a watcher, a believer in the language of the world itself. And so we begin, gently, in that first stretch of quiet sea, before storms, before discovery, before the distant lands rise from the mist, just the boat, the sea, and the deep, ancient knowing that the path lies not on maps, but in the rhythms of the earth and sky. The heart of a Viking voyage was not only the will of its sailors, but the vessel that carried them. The longship, slender, strong, and swift, was more than a tool of travel. It was a sacred creation, crafted with knowledge, reverence, and skill, passed from hand to hand, generation after generation. Imagine now a clearing near the shore, where tall pine trees stretch toward the gray sky. The scent of resin is strong in the air. Here, shipbuilders are at work, not with rush or carelessness, but with quiet focus. Every plank is chosen with care. Every nail is hammered with rhythm. The keel, the spine of the ship, is laid first. It will carry the weight of destiny. Pine and oak, favored for their flexibility and strength, are shaped with hand-forged tools, axes, scrapers, and knives made for both wood and ritual. The builders speak softly, sometimes singing, a whisper to the tree spirit as they shape its body, a pause to offer thanks before driving in the iron. For the Vikings, the act of shipbuilding was as spiritual as it was technical. The boat was not a dead object. It was alive, born of earth and tree, shaped by human hands, and destined to meet the sea like a bird meets the wind. The design of the longship was a marvel of early engineering. Its shallow draft allowed it to glide through deep fjords and shallow rivers alike. It could be pulled ashore or carried overland. Its curved prow and stern, often carved with dragon heads or serpents, were not just for decoration. They were wards, meant to scare away evil spirits and strike awe into the hearts of those watching from distant shores. Once completed, so the ship would be named. Naming a longship was a solemn act. The name might reflect speed, like Wave Runner, or honor a god, a place, or a dream. With the name came identity. The ship became part of the crew, a being to be respected and honored. Before its maiden voyage, a ship might be blessed with song or offering, a splash of blood, a bowl of ale poured at the bow, a carved talisman hung near the mast. Some say a sacrifice was sometimes made, an animal, rarely a person, so that the ship might carry the spirit safely across the sea. And when the ship finally met the water, it did not merely float, it flew. On the sea, the longship came alive. With sail raised and oars dipping like wings, it moved swiftly and with grace. Vikings could sail across great distances with uncanny precision, covering hundreds of kilometers in open ocean, guided only by what they saw, felt, and knew. The helmsman stood at the rear, holding the steering oar on the right-hand side, which gave rise to the word starboard. He watched the waves, the wind, the way the sail tugged. He listened to the ship's creaks and calls. A good helmsman could feel when the sea was about to change, before the sky darkened, before the wind shifted. Sailors worked in rhythm, Each oar pulled with the others. Each man knew his role. Some sang row songs to keep the beat and lift the spirit. When the wind favored them, the sail did the work, and the oars were pulled in. Yet it was not only function that mattered at sea. Rituals followed them wherever they went. If birds flew in circles, the voyage might be delayed. If whales were spotted, it might be a sign. If the sun hit the water a certain way, the men fell quiet, as if remembering something older than words. The ship was their world, their shelter, their shield. On long voyages, they ate dried fish, barley bread, and smoked meat. Water was stored in barrels, ale sometimes in leather pouches. When the sea grew rough, they held tight to ropes and prayer, some calling silently to Njord, others to Thor for strength. At night, when the sea calmed and stars pierced the sky, the crew would lie on their cloaks, staring up into the void. Some dreamed of home, others dreamed of lands unknown. All of them rocked in the breath of the sea, the ship cradling them like a mother. And always there was trust, not just in each other, but in the vessel beneath their feet, in the gods who watched from the clouds, in the ravens who flew overhead, in the wind that whispered direction into the sail. To sail was not just to move, it was to surrender and to believe, in wood and wave, in craft and courage, in the ancient dialogue between humankind and the great open sea. And so we drift forward, with the ship cutting gently through the gray-blue water, the oars quiet, the wind soft, the stars above blinking like ancient eyes. The long ship sails not only across the sea, but through time, through story, through memory. And we, gentle traveler, are aboard, safe, steady. Let the waters carry us onward into part 3 of our sacred journey. Out on the open sea, with no landmarks in sight and the horizon stretching endlessly in all directions, the Vikings depended on more than wood and wind to guide them. Their greatest tools were not carved or forged, but observed, remembered, and passed down. The sea, the sky, the flight of birds, the whisper of the wind, all spoke a language, and Viking navigators had learned to listen. At dawn, before the sky had fully brightened, the helmsman would rise from his cloak and walk quietly to the prow. He would not speak, he would watch. The color of the clouds, the angle of the sunrise, the feeling of moisture in the air, these were signs. Not dramatic, not loud, but gently suggestive. The world always gave clues. One of the most trusted tools on such voyages was not an object, but a memory. The path of the lead, the sea route. These sea routes were invisible but known. Passed orally through families and ship crews, they connected the fjords of Norway to the Shetlands, Iceland, Greenland, and even further west. Sailors knew that if they followed a certain line of stars, if they felt the swell beneath the keel shift a certain way, if birds began to circle, then land was near. Some routes were favored in summer, others in late spring. All were watched carefully for signs of change, currents, storms, strange wind patterns. Every journey became an act of deep attention. On cloudy days when stars were hidden, the Vikings turned to other techniques. They would feel the wind on their faces and study how the waves moved across the water. Sea swells travel in long, regular lines, often carrying the memory of distant land masses. Skilled sailors could tell where the waves had come from, shaped by coastlines far away. They would watch the sea's color. Near land, the water turned green or brownish. Far from shore, it was darker, more uniform. Floating seaweed, driftwood, or foam might suggest nearby islands or river mouths. The cries of birds were not only music, but messages. Certain birds never flew far from land. If they were seen flying high and in straight lines, it meant they were headed home. Vikings would release their own ravens and watch which direction they chose. These small movements became guides more reliable than any compass. And when all else failed, they turned to the sunstone. Legend tells of the Solarstein, a crystal that could find the sun's position even when clouds thickened and sky and sea became one. Held at a specific angle to the light, it would shine more brightly on one side, revealing where the hidden sun lay behind the veil. Whether this was scientific or spiritual, it did not matter. What mattered was that it worked, at least for those who believed. To the Viking sailor, navigation was not a science in charts or maps, but a full-body knowledge, something lived. The body remembered how the keel hummed in calm waters, how the wind felt on the right cheek at sunset when sailing south, how the stars turned slowly overhead as the boat gently rocked. And then, beyond the physical, there were signs of a different kind. Omens, a sudden gust with no wind before it, a strange calm in open water, a dream shared by more than one crewman. These things were not dismissed, they were read. Sometimes the crew would stop rowing. The helmsman would whisper a prayer. A pendant of Thor's hammer might be touched. A small offering of bread or ale poured into the water. The sea was alive. It could be angry. It could be generous. But always, it was watching. This deep respect shaped every voyage. Even the stories sailors told were part of this system of guidance, tales of those who had lost their way by ignoring the sky, of those who returned safely because they trusted the raven. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were maps made of memory. And in the dark hours, when the sea was still and the sky opened fully, the stars offered their wisdom once more. The Vikings saw not just points of light, but patterns, shapes that had meaning. The belt of Orion, which they may have called Frigg's distaff. The bear always circling. The North Star steady and constant. Each had its place, and each its lesson. Lying on the deck, a young sailor might quietly count the stars, tracing paths taught by his father and his father's father before him. In that moment, he would not feel lost. He would feel held between sea and sky, between old knowledge and tomorrow's discovery. To be a Viking navigator was to live in conversation with nature, with the gods, with the rhythms of the world. And even when they reached new shores, unfamiliar and wild, they knew they had not arrived by chance. The sea had allowed it, the sky had approved, the ravens had agreed. And so, in silence and reverence, they would step onto new land, not with arrogance, but with awareness. Because to know the way across the sea was not just to cross distance, it was to walk in harmony with all that lives and moves between sky and wave. When a Viking ship neared the end of its voyage, the sea did not fall silent. In fact, the moment of arrival when land rose from mist and mountains stood like sleeping gods, was a moment of great spiritual weight. Reaching new shores was not only a matter of survival or conquest, it was a communion, a crossing from one realm into another. And so, just as carefully as they watched the stars to guide their journey, the Vikings watched the coastline to mark their entry. A curved bay might resemble an open hand. A waterfall tumbling into the sea could be the tear of a forgotten spirit. These were not just natural features, they were signs, welcoming or warning. Landfall was sacred. When the ship's keel finally kissed sand or stone, the crew might fall into silence. Some would drop to one knee. A handful of soil might be lifted in a closed fist and offered back to the land spirits. This was not ritual for ritual's sake. It was respect. Every place had its guardians, the land vetter, the spirits of rock, tree, and field. To tread without offering was to risk misfortune, and so, before fires were lit or tents raised, a splash of mead or a piece of bread was left behind. Sometimes a song was sung. The land had given them safe passage. The sea had held them. The stars had kept their course. Gratitude was part of arrival. In some places, Vikings built hofs, simple wooden temples dedicated to the gods. These were not cathedrals, often little more than large halls or shrines. They were spaces for gathering, feasting, offering. Inside, carved figures might represent Thor or Odin or local deities whose names have long been lost to time. But the greatest temples were not built by hands. They were found. A ring of standing stones atop a hill, a grove of twisted oaks where birds never ceased their song, a cliff where thunder echoed even on clear days. These were vow, sacred places where the boundary between worlds thinned and the presence of the divine could be felt in wind and shadow. Sailors, once on land, might seek out these spaces before returning home. They would offer what they could, fish, cloth, a verse from memory, and they would ask, was this voyage in harmony? Had the sea accepted them? Had the gods watched with approval? These offerings, though simple, were filled with meaning. A shell polished by the tide, placed on a stone, a feather found in a new land, tied to a tree, a scar remembered not for pain, but for survival. Some voyages became pilgrimages, not for trade or conquest, but for connection. There are stories, quiet ones, of Viking sailors who followed the path of the sun, not to raid, but to witness. They believed that certain places held echoes of the gods, that islands hidden by fog or valleys unreachable by land were where the divine had once walked. These places were not mapped, they were sensed, and though much of what they saw may seem mundane to us now, a cluster of stones, a strange pattern of clouds, they carried back those visions like treasure. In fireside retellings, those stones became the seat of a forgotten Jotun, those clouds, the breath of a sky spirit. To navigate in the Viking way was to step between worlds. Every voyage had a physical route and a spiritual one. As they returned across the waves, sails full, cargo heavy with goods or memory, they remained vigilant. The journey home was just as sacred as the departure. The sea, generous or cruel, still demanded attention. The wind had its moods. The sky could shift with no warning. Often, as the coastline of home appeared, shouts would rise, half joy, half reverence. The longship would slow, oars dipped more gently. A raven might be released one final time, flying ahead, as if to announce their return. And then, the harbor, the welcome, children running down stone paths, smoke rising from longhouses, fires lit along the shore. The ship, now weathered, gliding in like a guest returning from distant halls. And in the hearts of the crew, a quiet knowing. They had been kept safe. They had been seen. They had listened well to the sea, to the stars, to the breath of the gods. And now, as they stepped once more onto familiar soil, they would remember. Not just the miles crossed, but the signs read, the silences honored, the lessons carried not on scrolls, but in soul. Because the greatest journey of the Viking sailor was not to new lands, but to deeper knowing. As the journey ended and the ship was pulled ashore, the waves still whispered, the sea did not forget, and neither did the people who once sailed it, not with maps or journals, but with memory, story, and sacred repetition. The return from voyage was never simply the end of travel, it was a transformation. When a Viking sailor stepped back onto familiar land, he did so changed. His boots carried grains of sand from unknown shores. His cloak held the scent of foreign fire smoke, and his mind carried silence, starlight, and echoes of the deep. What he had seen and endured would become more than experience. It would become guidance. That guidance, like a thread spun by the Norns themselves, would be woven back into the village. Children would gather by the hearth, eyes wide, as sailors shared tales not only of beasts and storms, but of how the sea sounded when it slept, how the sun rose at the edge of the world, how the raven knew which way to fly when all else was uncertain. These were not stories for entertainment. They were seeds of wisdom. Older generations listened too, silently, measuring each word, comparing it to what they knew, weighing the truth not by proof, but by resonance. In this way, the navigation of the Vikings became a living tradition, not written, but spoken, not preserved in books, but in people. Much of this knowledge was passed through rhythm, poems, chants, songs. These patterns helped memory take root. A young boy might repeat a sailor's chant about the North Star before sleep, long before he ever stood on the deck of a ship. A young girl might learn to read the sea by watching the glint of light on water during her chores. This was not training, it was absorption. The sea routes of the Vikings were not straight lines, they were spirals. Each voyage circled back into the community. Each sailor returned not just with cargo, but with insight. And those insights became part of the collective way of seeing the world as something alive, responsive, mysterious, and sacred. Even in death, the sea remained central. A chieftain who had sailed many seas might be laid to rest in a ship burial, surrounded by goods from his travels. Amber from the Baltic, silk from the East, feathers from distant forests. His soul was believed to continue traveling, not bound to earth, but carried forward through the same stars and winds that had once guided him in life. For the Vikings, there was no final destination, only continued movement. Valhalla itself, that great hall of the honored dead, was not a place of rest, but of readiness. Warriors trained, feasted, waited. Always the sea lay nearby. Always the winds were whispering of what came next. In this way, the spiritual navigation of the Vikings mirrored their physical one. You did not arrive simply to stop. You arrived to begin again, changed. And so, even now, when the longships no longer sail and the ravens fly free over silent fjords, the knowledge remains. In stone circles, hidden in moss, in runes carved into old wood, in the way the northern lights flicker and pulse, like a whisper across time. It's said that those who still and listen can feel it. The thrum of oars in water, the snap of canvas in wind, the hush before land is sighted, the sacredness of movement. The gods of the Norse world, Odin, a god of wisdom and wandering, Njord, lord of wind and tide, Freya, mistress of magic and memory, are not gone. Their presence is felt not in doctrine, but in awareness. A lone traveler watching the stars on a quiet night, a sailor breathing deeply before casting off, a child watching the sun rise over water and wondering where it goes. In these small moments, the old ways remain, because the sea never truly forgets, and those who once crossed it, with heart and hand, with raven and sunstone, with fear and faith, left more than paths behind. They left a way of seeing, a way of listening, a way of moving through the world that honored both the known and the unknown. And in that movement, in that sacred navigation, they did not merely sail from place to place. They sailed between worlds,